The Arizona sun has a way of bleaching secrets, but some are buried too deep for its rays. They're carried in the heart or, in the case of Ilara Vance, seared directly into her skin. When her stagecoach rattled into the dusty throat of Redemption Gulch, she was just another ghost seeking a place to disappear, a woman with eyes that held the memory of fire. But in that unforgiving land, she was seen. Seen by Cale the giant Chiricahua Apache, the townsfolk called Shadow Walker, a man whose silence was heavier than any threat. They were two broken souls from warring worlds destined to collide. But what was the terrible truth she guarded so fiercely? And why did its unveiling in a moment of desperate trust promise to bring the entire territory to its knees? The stagecoach lurched one final time, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding to a halt in a sigh of dust and exhausted leather. For Ilara Vance, the end of the line felt less like an arrival, and more like a surrender. She stepped out her worn boots, sinking into the fine cinnamon-colored dirt of Redemption Gulch. The town was little more than a single wide scar gouged between two sun-scorched mesas, a collection of tired clapboard buildings squinting under the oppressive glare of the 1878 Arizona sun. Ilara clutched the handle of her small carpet bag, the knuckles of her gloved hand showing white. She kept her head down her wide-brimmed hat, casting a merciful shadow over her face. She was not a beautiful woman in the delicate porcelain way of the magazines that found their way west. Her features were too sharp, her frame too slender, honed by something more than hardship by fear. But it was her eyes that held the truth of her. The color of a stormy sky, they darted and scanned, never resting, cataloguing every shadow, every doorway, every man who watched her pass. The town's welcome was a symphony of silence. The blacksmith's hammer ceased its ringing. The boisterous laughter from the saloon dwindled to a murmur. A woman shaking a rug from an upstairs window paused her arms, frozen mid-motion. Ilara was new. And in a place like Redemption, Gulch New was a synonym for trouble. She made her way to the Mercantile, the only establishment that seemed to possess a semblance of quiet dignity. The proprietor, a balding man named Henry Gable, with a sweat-stained collar, eyed her with undisguised curiosity. "Looking for something, miss?" he asked, his voice flat. A room, she replied, her own voice, softer than she intended, almost swallowed by the vastness of the land outside. And perhaps work? "I'm a capable seamstress," Henry grunted, wiping a counter that was already clean. "Boarding house is 2 doors down. Ask for Martha. As for work—" He trailed off his gaze, drifting past her out the window. His expression tightened. Ilara followed his gaze. Standing across the street in the stark shade of the livery stable was a man who seemed less a part of the town and more an extension of the wilderness itself. He was Apache, that much was clear from his high cheekbones, the straight line of his black hair held back by a simple leather band and the buckskin leggings he wore. But it was his sheer size that was arresting. He was immense, not in girth but in height and breadth of shoulder, built with the long, powerful lines of a canyon predator. He wasn't just tall, he was towering, a giant cast in bronze and shadow. He held a string of rabbit pelts in one hand, but his attention was not on the Mercantile. It was fixed squarely on her. His eyes, dark and unreadable, met hers across the dusty expanse. There was no malice in his stare, but an unnerving intensity, a stillness that felt more profound than any movement. It was the look of a hunter who had spotted something unexpected on the wind. "Best you pay him no mind," Henry Gable muttered, turning back to his counter. "That's Kyle, Chiricahua. He trades sometimes. Mostly he just watches. A ghost with a heartbeat. Ilara broke the gaze first, her own heart, a frantic bird against her ribs. She felt exposed, as if his eyes had peeled back the layers of her worn dress, her carefully constructed composure, and seen the damaged thing hiding beneath. She paid for a small sack of flour and a bar of soap, her hands trembling slightly as she counted out the coins. That night, in a small stuffy room at Martha's boarding house, Ilara lay awake, listening to the alien sounds of the desert night. The town was a fragile outpost of noise and light in an ocean of silent waiting darkness. In her mind, she saw two things. The first was the face from her past, a face with eyes cold as river stones, and a voice like honey laced with arsenic. The face of Silas Blackwood. The second was the face of the Apache Cale. In his gaze, she had not seen the judgment or the leering curiosity of the other men. She had seen something far more terrifying recognition, not of her face, but of the fear she carried. It was a look that said, "I know what it is to be hunted," and that more than anything else told her that Redemption Gulch was not the end of the line. It was merely another stop on a journey she could never escape. Days bled into weeks, each one marked by the same relentless sun and the fine, pervasive dust that settled on everything. Ilara, true to her word, proved to be more than a capable seamstress. She was an artist with a needle and thread. Martha, the stern, pragmatic owner of the boarding house, was the first to give her work, mending torn shirts and darning socks for the boarders. Soon word spread. The women of Redemption Gulch, starved for a touch of civility in their hard-scrabble lives, began to bring her their precious fabrics, asking for dresses that might remind them of the homes they'd left behind. Ilara established a small space in a corner of the boarding house parlor. She was quiet, diligent and polite. She spoke when spoken to, offered gentle smiles that never quite reached her storm-grey eyes, and never ever spoke of her past. She learned the rhythms of the town, the morning clang of the blacksmith's anvil, the rowdy crescendo of the saloon on payday, the Sunday morning solemnity of the circuit preacher's sermon. She became a familiar, if enigmatic part of the town's fabric. A ghost, as Henry Gable had said, but one who could mend a torn seam. Yet her peace was a fragile facade. Every time a rider came into town too fast, her blood would turn to ice. Every unfamiliar voice, raised in anger, sent a tremor through her hands, threatening her steady stitchwork. She lived in a constant low hum of anxiety. Her secret was a physical weight, a brand of heated iron that she felt every morning when she dressed, and every night when she lay down to sleep. The high-necked, long-sleeved dresses she wore, even in the sweltering heat, were not a matter of modesty, but of survival. She saw the Apache Cale intermittently. He would appear at the edge of town as silently as a hawk's shadow, conduct his trade with Henry Gable, and disappear back into the vast, indifferent wilderness. He never spoke to her, but she always felt his eyes on her. It wasn't the predatory stare of the saloon toughs or the dismissive glance of the respectable townsfolk. It was a gaze of quiet, unnerving assessment. One sweltering afternoon, as she was returning from the mercantile with a spool of thread, a gust of wind, a sudden violent exhalation from the desert, tore her hat from her head. It cartwheeled across the dusty street, coming to rest near the water trough where Kyle was letting his horse drink. For a moment they both stood frozen. The townsfolk who were present stopped to watch the silent tableau. For a white woman to interact with an Apache, especially one as imposing and feared as Cale was, to court gossip, if not outright ostracization. Ilara's heart hammered. To leave the hat was to seem proud and disdainful. To retrieve it was to approach him. Her hair loosened from its pins, whipped around her face, and she felt a surge of panic at the unaccustomed exposure. Slowly, deliberately, Kyle bent down. His movements were fluid, economical, possessing a grace that seemed impossible for a man of his size. He picked up the hat, holding it by the brim as if it were a delicate, fragile thing. He took a step towards her, then another, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed earth. He stopped a few feet away, close enough for her to see the fine lines etched at the corners of his eyes, the faint, silvery scar that traced his jawline. He held the hat out to her. His face remained impassive, a mask of carved granite. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her hand trembled as she reached out to take it, her gloved fingers brushing against his. His skin was warm, calloused, and felt as solid as the rock of the mesas. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his dark eyes holding hers for a heartbeat longer than was comfortable. In that moment, she felt that strange sense of recognition again. He saw the tremor in her hand, the fear she tried so desperately to conceal. And he did not mock it. He turned without another word and swung himself onto his horse, a powerful beast as dark and silent as its rider. He nudged the horse forward, riding out of town, not with a gallop, but with a steady, ground-eating pace that spoke of immense patience and purpose. Ilara fled back to the boarding house, her face burning. The whispers started almost immediately. "Did you see that? The nerve of him." And she let him get that close. Martha should watch who she keeps under her roof. That evening, the town's part-time physician, Dr. Elias Croft, stopped by on the pretense of having a shirt mended. He was a kind, weary man in his late 50s, with spectacles perched on his nose, and a deep sadness in his eyes that Ilara recognized as a kindred spirit. "Pay them no mind, Miss Vance," he said softly, handing her the garment. "Their world is very small, and anything that doesn't fit inside it frightens them." He looked at her pointedly. "Cole. He is not the monster they imagine. He has more honor than any 10 men in that saloon. He fought with Crook's scouts. He knows this land better than the lizards and the snakes, and he knows people." Ilara didn't reply, merely focused on the thread, the needle, the simple, repetitive motion. But the doctor's words lingered. He knows people. The hum of anxiety within her grew louder. The town was beginning to feel less like a refuge and more like a cage. And she knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the bars of that cage were drawing tighter. For a hunter like Silas Blackwood, a woman who drew the attention of a giant Apache scout would eventually cast a shadow long enough to be seen from a great distance. The arrival of the 3 riders was different. It wasn't the weary slouch of cowboys after a long drive, or the hopeful posture of prospectors. These men rode with a rigid, upright bearing that spoke of unshakable purpose. They wore dark dusters despite the heat, and their faces were grim, set like stone. They didn't stop at the saloon. They made a direct line for the sheriff's office. From her window in the parlor, Ilara watched them. A cold dread, familiar and sickening, washed over her. It was in the way they carried themselves, an arrogant piety that masked a deep-seated cruelty. It was the posture of the acolytes of the Church of the Divine Hand, the faithful followers of Silas Blackwood. Her hands, which had been deftly guiding a piece of blue calico under the needle, froze. The needle pricked her finger, and a single perfect crimson bead welled up, staining the fabric. She stared at it, mesmerized. Blood on blue. A bad omen. The town buzzed with speculation. Sheriff Brody, a man whose authority was directly proportional to the amount of whiskey in his gut, was seen talking with the men, his usual bluster replaced with a nervous deference. The leader of the trio, a man with a scarred lip and dead reptilian eyes, did most of the talking. Elara would later learn his name was Jebediah Kane, Blackwood's most trusted and ruthless enforcer. They didn't have a name. They had a description. A woman traveling alone, slender with dark hair and stormy eyes, quiet, keeps to herself. She might have sought work as a seamstress or a governess. Jebediah described her as a fallen lamb, an errant soul. Their benevolent leader, Judge Blackwood, wished to guide back to the flock. The description was broadcast in the saloon, at the Mercantile, in the livery. It was vague enough to be anyone, yet specific enough to be Elara. She felt the net closing, the eyes of the town turning on her, not with the lazy curiosity of before, but with a new calculating suspicion. A reward was mentioned, a substantial one for information leading to the woman's safe return. Elara's carefully constructed world began to crumble. The friendly nods from townsfolk became guarded stares. Mrs. Gable, who had commissioned a new Sunday dress, suddenly found an excuse to postpone the fitting. The whispers that had followed her encounter with Cale now took on a more sinister tone. What was she hiding? Why would such important-looking men be searching for a simple seamstress? Dr. Croft saw the terror in her. He found her late one evening, still sitting in the darkened parlour, her sewing untouched in her lap. "They're looking for you, aren't they?" he asked gently, his voice devoid of judgment. Elara could only nod, a knot of fear too tight in her throat to allow words. Silas Blackwood, she finally managed to whisper the name, tasting like ash in her mouth. The doctor's face paled. He had heard the name. Everyone in the territory had. A charismatic preacher who had amassed a fortune in land and followers, a man who spoke of purity and salvation, but whose name was always linked to whispers of violence, of people who entered his community and were never seen again. They called him the Judge, for he dealt out his own form of divine justice. "My God, child," Elias Croft breathed. "What did you ever do to get tangled up with a man like that? I was his wife?" She said the words falling like stones into the silence. Or rather, his property. The confession hung in the air, heavy and damning. Before the doctor could respond, the front door of the boarding house burst open. Two of the boarders, rough-looking miners with eyes glinting with greed, stumbled in. "It's her," one of them slurred, pointing a trembling finger at Elara. "Fits the description. Dark hair, stormy eyes. We're going to be rich." He lunged for her. Dr. Croft, with surprising speed, stepped between them, brandishing a heavy medical textbook like a shield. "Get out of here, you drunken fools, get out!" But the damage was done. The shout had been heard in the street. Windows were thrown open. The door to the saloon swung wide, spilling men out into the night. And at the far end of the street, standing in the moonlight, Jebediah Kane turned his head, his scarred lip twisting into a triumphant smile. He had found her. "Run, Elara." Dr. Croft urged, his voice strained. "Go out the back. Don't follow the road. Head for the mesas. The wilderness is your only chance now." Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. She fled through the back of the house, her heart pounding, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She scrambled over a low fence, her dress catching and tearing on a splintered post. She ran into the oppressive darkness of the desert, the jeers and shouts of the town fading behind her. She had no water, no food, no sense of direction. She only knew she had to run. She ran from the men who sought to claim a reward, from the scarred face of Jebediah Kane, from the memory of Silas Blackwood's chilling smile. She ran towards the one place she had been warned against, the vast, unforgiving wilderness that was the domain of the Apache, the domain of Cale. The desert at night was a different beast, the familiar sun-baked landscape transformed into a treacherous world of deep shadows and unseen things that slithered and scuttled. The air, once scorching, grew cold, and a profound, unnerving silence pressed in on Ilara, broken only by her own ragged breaths and the frantic beating of her heart. She stumbled through arroyos, her city boots slipping on loose rock. Thorny branches of mesquite and catclaw tore at her dress, and her skin leaving a crisscross of stinging scratches on her arms. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps behind her. Every shadow of a towering saguaro cactus looked like a man waiting in ambush. By dawn, she was hopelessly lost. The adrenaline that had fueled her flight had given way to a crushing exhaustion. Her throat was a desert in itself, raw and parched. The rising sun was not a promise of hope, but a threat, a malevolent eye in a brazen sky, promising a slow, agonizing death by heat and thirst. She found a sliver of shade beneath a rock outcropping, and collapsed her body, trembling with fatigue and despair. This was it. This was how it ended. Not in the chilling grip of Silas Blackwood, but in the anonymous, indifferent embrace of the Arizona wilderness. She had run so far, only to die alone. Tears of frustration and fear carved clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. She closed her eyes, the world dissolving into a red-tinged darkness. When she awoke, it was to a shadow falling over her. Her eyes snapped open, her body tensing for a fight she could not win. But it was not Jebediah Kane or the miners from town. It was Kyle. He stood over her, as silent and imposing as the monoliths of rock that dotted the landscape. In the harsh morning light, he looked even larger, more formidable. He held a small water skin in his hand. His expression was, as always, unreadable, but his dark eyes seemed to hold a flicker of something she couldn't name, pity, perhaps, or a grim understanding. Fear, primal and instinctive, warred with her desperate thirst. He was Apache. The stories she'd heard all her life were of savagery, of a people who were the sworn enemies of her own. He must have seen the conflict in her eyes. He knelt not too close and set the water skin on the ground between them. Then he backed away a few paces, a gesture of peace, of reassurance. "Tudici," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant thunder. It was the first time she had heard him speak more than a single word. He pointed to the water skin. Water. Her thirst was a screaming agony that overpowered all other thoughts. With a trembling hand, she reached for the skin. It was heavier than it looked. She fumbled with the stopper and brought it to her cracked lips, drinking greedily. The water was cool and clean, the most precious thing she had ever tasted. She drank until she had to stop gasping for breath, then drank again. Kyle watched her, his patience absolute. When she was finished, he retrieved the skin and gestured with his head. "They will follow your tracks. The town men are fools, but Blackwood's man. He is not." The name Blackwood from his lips sent a fresh jolt of fear through her. "How do you know that name? I listen," he said, simply. "I watch. I know a wolf by the fear it leaves on the wind. You have been running for a long time." He offered her a hand to help her up. His grip was firm, enveloping her small hand completely. She was unsteady on her feet, the world tilting precariously. He steadied her with a hand on her elbow, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Where are you taking me?" she asked, her voice raspy. "To a place they will not look, where the rock hides the trail, and the wind sings a different song." He led her not back towards the town, but deeper into the wilderness, into the labyrinthine canyons and mesas that were his home. The journey was a blur of exhaustion and pain. Kyle moved with an tireless, ground-eating stride, but he adjusted his pace to hers, often stopping to allow her to rest. He showed her how to walk on rock instead of sand, to leave less of a trail, how to read the subtle signs of the land. He took her to a hidden place, a shallow cave nestled high on a cliff face, accessible only by a narrow winding path. The entrance was veiled by a curtain of ancient vines, making it invisible from below. Inside it was cool and sheltered. A small smokeless fire burned in a pit, and sleeping pallets of dried grass and soft furs lay against the far wall. It was a place of safety, a sanctuary carved from the living rock. For 2 days, Ilara did little but sleep and drink the water Kyle provided. He brought her roasted rabbit and strange, sweet roots he dug from the earth. He tended to the cuts on her arms and face with a salve made from herbs that smelled of pine and damp earth. He did all this with a quiet, unobtrusive efficiency, speaking very little. In the silence of their refuge, a strange, unspoken trust began to form. He was her captor and her savior, a terrifying figure from a world of whispered warnings who was showing her nothing but kindness. She found herself watching him as he worked, mending a leather strap or sharpening a knife. His hands, though large and calloused, were precise and skilled. There was a deep stillness about him, a centeredness that she, a woman who had lived her life in a state of constant inner turmoil, found both baffling and profoundly calming. She knew this sanctuary was temporary. Jebediah Kane was out there. Silas Blackwood was out there. The world had not forgotten her. But here in this hidden cleft in the rock with this silent giant man as her guardian, she could breathe for the first time in years. She had run from one cage into another, yet this one, for all its wildness, felt more like freedom than anything she had ever known. On the 3rd day, a fever took hold of Ilara. It began as a shiver. She couldn't shake a deep chill that had nothing to do with the cool air of the cave. By nightfall her skin was burning, and she was lost in a delirious haze, tossing on the pallet of furs, muttering fragments of prayers and pleas. Kyle watched her with growing concern. He recognized the signs of infection. One of the deeper cuts on her shoulder, where she had fallen against a jagged rock during her flight, was inflamed and angry-looking. The sleeve of her dress was crusted with dried blood around it. He knew he had to clean the wound properly, or the fever would consume her. He knelt beside her, placing a cool, damp cloth on her forehead. She flinched at his touch, but didn't pull away. "The wound must be cleaned," he said, his voice low and calm, trying to cut through the fog of her delirium. "I must see it." Her eyes, glassy with fever, focused on him for a moment. A flicker of her old sharp fear returned. "No," she mumbled. "No, please. It is poisoning your blood." He insisted, his tone gentle but firm. "Let me help you." He reached for the buttons at the collar of her dress. Her reaction was instantaneous and violent. She recoiled, scrambling backwards until her back hit the cold stone of the cave wall. "No." She cried the word raw with a terror that went far beyond the fever. She clutched the fabric of her dress at her shoulder, shielding her body, as if his gaze were a physical blow. Her eyes were wide, lucid with panic. "You can't, I'm not clean," she whispered, the words ragged and broken. The phrase hung in the air between them, imbued with a shame so profound it was almost a physical presence in the small cave. Kyle stared at her, his expression unreadable. Not clean. To him, the words of her language were often strange. Cleanliness was about dirt and water. But the way she said it, the deep, soul-shaking horror in her voice, this was something else entirely. It was a sickness of the spirit. "Your spirit is not the thing that is sick," he said softly, his gaze holding hers. "It is your body. The poison must come out." He moved towards her again, slowly, his hands held open to show he meant no harm. Tears streamed down Ilara's face. She was trapped, trapped by the fever, by the cave, by the man in front of her, and most of all by the secret she had guarded for so long. She was too weak to fight him, too weak to run. All she could do was surrender. Her fight seemed to drain out of her, replaced by a shuddering resignation. She gave a small, defeated nod. With immense care, Kyle's fingers went to the buttons. He undid them, one by one, his touch surprisingly deft. He gently eased the torn and dirty fabric of her dress off her shoulder. The cloth fell, and the giant Apache's heart stopped. It wasn't the infected wound that made the breath catch in his throat. It was what lay just beside it, a mark that covered most of her shoulder blade. It was a brand, an intricate, ugly symbol of a clenched fist holding a lightning bolt surrounded by twisting thorns. It was seared into her flesh, a permanent scar of ownership, of subjugation. It was a mark of profound violation, a desecration of her very being. He had seen brands on cattle. He had seen the scars of whips on the backs of runaway slaves. He had seen the wounds of war and the marks of torture. But this was different. This was a mark of zealous, possessive cruelty, designed not just to cause pain, but to obliterate a person's identity, to claim them body and soul. His heart, which he thought had been hardened by a lifetime of loss and battle, felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang. It was not revulsion. It was a deep, gut-wrenching wave of empathy. He looked from the horrific brand to her face, to the tear tracks on her cheeks, and the abject shame in her eyes. And in that moment he understood the true nature of the beast she was running from. This was the work of Silas Blackwood. Without a word, Cale stood up and turned his back to her. He pulled the leather tunic he wore over his head. Ilara flinched, expecting, she didn't know what, a blow revulsion. Instead, she saw his back. His skin, the color of desert earth, was a road map of a violent life. There were the pale, silvery lines of old knife wounds, the puckered star of a bullet hole near his shoulder, and a long, jagged scar that ran from his neck down his spine, a testament to a battle that had nearly killed him. But there was more. Low on his left side, just above his hip, was a brand of his own. It was a crude, simple cross, the mark of a Spanish mission that had captured him and his family when he was just a boy, a place where they tried to beat the Apache out of him. He turned his head slightly, his profile stark in the firelight. "We all have things that mark us," he said, his voice quiet but resonant. "They do not make us unclean. They are the story of our survival." Ilara stared at his back, at the stories written on his skin. She looked at her own brand, the symbol of her shame, and for the first time she saw it not just as a mark of her defilement, but as a testament to the fact that she had escaped. She had survived. The dam of her composure, held together for years by sheer will, finally broke. A deep, wrenching sob escaped her, then another. It was a sound of grief, of pain held in for too long, but also of a profound and startling release. Kyle turned back and knelt before her once more. He didn't touch her, didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply waited, his presence a solid, unwavering anchor in her storm. When her sobs subsided into ragged breaths, he took a clean cloth, dipped it in a decoction of boiled herbs, and began to clean her wound. Her secret was out. The ugliest, most hidden part of her had been laid bare, and the man who had seen it had not recoiled in horror. He had shown her his own scars. In the heart of the wilderness, in a hidden cave, two broken people from two warring worlds had found a common language, the language of survival, written in scars upon the skin. The breaking of the fever was also the breaking of a barrier. With her secret revealed, and met not with disgust, but with a shared, silent understanding, the dynamic between Ilara and Cale shifted. The fear she held for him evaporated, completely replaced by a deep, burgeoning trust. The silence that had once been a space of caution between them now became one of comfortable companionship. While Ilara regained her strength, Kyle began to teach her. He was a patient, methodical instructor. He showed her which plants were for medicine and which were for food. He taught her how to find water by observing the flight of birds and the green of the foliage deep in the canyons. He showed her how to move silently, to place her feet so the earth barely registered her passing. She was a surprisingly apt pupil, her senses sharpened by years of living in a state of constant vigilance. Blackwood's man Jebediah he will not give up, Kyle said one evening as they sat by the fire. He was sharpening an arrowhead with a piece of obsidian, his hands moving with practiced economy. A wolf that has the scent of blood will hunt until it or its prey is dead. Then we cannot stay here forever. Ilara stated, her voice stronger now, laced with a new resolve. No, Kyle agreed. We cannot run forever. A hunt must end. Either the hunter makes his kill, or the prey turns and fights. The thought of fighting, of turning to face the source of her terror, sent a familiar tremor through her. But it was different now. It was no longer the paralyzing fear of a cornered animal. It was the fear of a fighter sizing up her opponent. Kyle's quiet strength was infectious. He began to tell her stories of his own past. He spoke of his childhood with the Chiricahua, before the world changed, of the raids by the Nakai, the Mexicans who had taken him and his sister. He spoke of the mission brand of his escape, and of the long years learning to survive alone. He told her of his time as a scout for General Crook, a decision that had alienated him from some of his own people who saw him as a traitor. He was a man caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. They call me a ghost, he said, his eyes on the flickering flames. Perhaps they are right. I live in the spaces between. The past is a shadow I cannot outrun, and the future, it does not have a place for men like me. Or women like me, Ilara added softly. She in turn told him everything. She spoke of Silas Blackwood, not as a monster, but as the charismatic, magnetic man he had first appeared to be. A savior who had offered her a penniless orphan, a home and a purpose. She described the slow, insidious poisoning of his community, the way his words of love twisted into rules of control, his sermons of purity into justifications for brutal punishment. The brand was his ultimate mark of ownership, given to those who, like her, had dared to question his divinity. Her escape had not just been a flight for her life, it had been a flight for her very soul. As they spoke, a bond deeper than mere survival was forged. It was a connection born of shared trauma, of recognizing the same scars on another's spirit. Their idyllic sanctuary was shattered one clear, cold night. They were outside the cave Ilara, learning the names of the stars from Kyle, when he suddenly stiffened. He held up a hand for silence, his head cocked, listening to something she could not hear. "What is it?" she whispered. "Horses," he said, his voice a low growl. "And a campfire. Down canyon. They are close." Jebediah had found them. Or at least he had found their general location. He was a better tracker than Kale had anticipated. The hunt was on again. But this time, Ilara was not just a terrified refugee. She was a student of the wilderness, and she was with its master. They moved under the light of a hunter's moon, a silver disk that cast long, treacherous shadows. Kyle led them through a brutal, unforgiving landscape, a maze of stone and thorns. They waded through cold streams to hide their scent, scaled sheer rock faces that left Ilara's muscles screaming and her fingers raw. Kyle was a phantom, his massive frame seeming to melt into the shadows. He pushed her, tested her limits, but never left her behind. Once they lay flat on a high ledge, concealed by a scrubby juniper, as Jebediah and his 2 men rode directly below them. Ilara could see the glint of the moon on their rifle barrels, could hear Jebediah's gravelly voice cursing the land. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure they would hear it. Kyle simply placed a calming hand on her shoulder, his touch solid and reassuring. The riders passed oblivious. They were no longer just running. Kyle was leading the hunters on a chase, wearing them down, drawing them deeper into his territory, a land where he held every advantage. He was turning the tables. During a brief rest in a narrow slot canyon, Ilara looked at Kyle, his face illuminated by the moonlight filtering down from above. His expression was fierce, focused. He was no longer the quiet outcast who traded pelts in town. He was a warrior in his element. "You're not running from them, are you?" she realized aloud. "You're hunting them." A faint, grim smile touched his lips. A man who lives in the spaces between learns that he must make his own place. Blackwood's shadow has fallen over you. Now it has fallen over my home. A shadow like that must be removed, not by running from it, but by cutting out its heart. Ilara looked down at her own hands. They were scratched and calloused, but they were steady. She thought of Silas, of his cold eyes, and his belief in his own righteous power. She thought of the brand on her shoulder, a symbol of her submission. "Then let's cut it out," she said, her voice clear and strong in the canyon silence. The prey had turned, and she was ready to fight. Returning to redemption, Gulch was Kyle's idea, and it was as terrifying as it was brilliant. "Jebediah thinks he is the hunter," Kyle explained as they watched the town from a high ridge 2 days later. "He believes we are cornered in the wilderness. He will not expect us to walk back into the trap. They'll see us coming a mile away," Ilara argued, her stomach churning with anxiety. "They will see me," Kyle corrected. "He is hunting a frightened woman and the savage who helped her. He is not prepared for what he will find." Their plan was desperate, relying on surprise and the psychology of their enemy. They descended from the mesa under the cover of dusk, slipping into the town not as fugitives, but as silent invaders. The town was on edge. Jebediah and his men had made the saloon their headquarters, and their armed, arrogant presence had cowed the locals, including Sheriff Brody. The first part of the plan was chaos. Using his knowledge of the land, Kale started a small, controlled brush fire on the east side of town. The wind was in their favor, carrying the smoke and the alarming orange glow directly toward the settlement. As shouts of fire erupted and panicked, men grabbed buckets and formed a line. Kyle moved to the livery stable. With a few swift, silent movements, he cut the tethers of Jebediah's horses, slapping their rumps and sending them galloping out into the night. The hunters were now on foot. While the town was distracted, Ilara walked directly to the doctor's office. Elias Croft opened the door, his face a mask of weary shock at the sight of her. "My God, child, I thought you were dead." "Not yet, Doctor," she said, a new, hard-won confidence in her voice. "But I need your help." Meanwhile, Kale dealt with Jebediah's 2 men. He took them down not with a gun, but with the brutal efficiency of a predator. One was rendered unconscious with a single powerful blow from behind as he ran toward the fire. The other found himself face to face with the Apache giant in a dark alleyway, a knife at his throat before he could even draw his pistol. Kyle left him bound and gagged behind a stack of barrels. The main event was Jebediah. Lured from the saloon by the commotion, he stood in the middle of the street, bellowing orders when he saw a figure emerge from the shadows. It was Ilara. She stood alone, her dress torn, her face smudged with dirt. But her back was straight, and her gaze was unwavering. She looked nothing like the timid, frightened creature he had been hunting. "Looking for me, Jebediah," she called out, her voice carrying in the sudden lull of the wind. His face split into a cruel grin. The fool girl had come back. "The judge will be pleased," he snarled, raising his Colt. "He prefers to mete out his justice personally, but in your case, I'll make an exception." Before he could fire, a shadow detached itself from the wall of the mercantile. Kyle. He held a bow, an arrow nocked, and aimed squarely at Jebediah's heart. "She is not alone." Kyle's voice boomed, stopping Jebediah cold. The townsfolk, their attention torn from the fire, now turned to the drama unfolding in their main street. It was a standoff. But this was never meant to be a simple gunfight. At that moment, Dr. Croft emerged from his office, holding a lantern high. "This woman is no fallen lamb," he shouted, his voice ringing with uncharacteristic passion. "She is a survivor of the monster you serve." He strode toward Ilara. "Show them, child. Show them the benevolence of your Judge Blackwood." This was the hardest part. All of Ilara's instincts screamed at her to hide, to cover herself. But she met Kyle's steady gaze across the street, saw the faith in his eyes, and found her strength. With a deep breath, she turned her back to the assembled crowd. She reached for the torn fabric of her dress at her shoulder and pulled it aside. Dr. Croft raised the lantern higher. In the flickering yellow light, the ugly, intricate brand on her skin was thrown into stark relief. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. They were frontiersmen, familiar with the harsh brands for cattle, but this was a human being. The symbol was so clearly an instrument of ownership, of cruel and absolute possession. Jebediah's smug expression faltered. He had expected fear and submission, not this defiant act of revelation. His power, Blackwood's power, relied on shame, on secrets kept in the dark. Ilara was dragging it into the light. "This is the mark of your judge," she cried, her voice trembling but strong. "This is his purity. This is his love. It is the brand of a slave master, not a savior." The townspeople looked from the scar on her back to Jebediah, their expressions shifting from fear to dawning disgust. Sheriff Brody, who had been cowering near the saloon doors, seemed to find a sliver of his long-lost spine. Jebediah saw his authority evaporating. Enraged, he made his choice. He swung his pistol away from Ilara toward the bigger threat, Kyle. But Kyle had been waiting for this. He was not a gunman. He did not play by their rules. The bowstring twanged. The arrow flew, not a killing shot to the heart, but a crippling one. It struck Jebediah in the thigh, sinking deep. He screamed and collapsed, his pistol clattering on the ground. It was over. The fire was contained. Jebediah and his men were locked in the town's jail cell to be handed over to the territorial marshals, with a story of attempted kidnapping and assault, backed by a dozen new witnesses. In the quiet aftermath, as the dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and grey, Ilara and Kale stood at the edge of town near his horse. "Where will you go now?" he asked. She looked back at Redemption Gulch. It was just a dusty, hard-scrabble town, but she had faced her demon there. She had spoken her truth. It was no longer a place to hide. She looked at the brand on her shoulder, no longer feeling its sting of shame, but the dull ache of a wound that could finally begin to heal. "I don't know," she admitted, and for the first time the uncertainty didn't feel like fear. It felt like freedom. "I'm not that frightened seamstress anymore. I don't know who I am yet, but I'm going to find out." She looked at him, at the giant Apache, who had seen her at her most broken, and shown her his own scars. What about you? Will you go back to being a ghost? Kael looked out at the vast wilderness, his home. Then he looked back at her. A rare, true smile touched his lips, transforming his harsh features. A ghost cannot feel the sun, he said. And I think I am ready to feel the sun again. He mounted his horse, then looked down at her, offering his hand. The world is a large place. There may be a space for us yet. Not between the worlds, but one of our own making. Ilara Vance, the woman who had arrived in Redemption Gulch looking for a place to disappear, took his hand, and together they rode out into the sunrise, not as fugitives, but as survivors, their path lit by the promise of a new day. And so the story of Ilara Vance and the giant Apache Kael isn't one that ends with a simple ride into the sunset. It's the story of how our deepest scars, the marks we believe make us unclean, can become our greatest source of strength when we have the courage to bring them into the light. It's a reminder that true sanctuary is not a place, but a connection, an understanding forged between two souls who have seen the worst of the world and choose to face the dawn together. Their journey was just beginning a new chapter, to be written not in fear, but in freedom. If this story of survival and the courage to reveal our deepest wounds resonated with you, please hit that like button to let us know. Share it with someone who loves a story where the heart of the West beats wild and true. And most importantly, if you haven't already subscribed to our channel and ring that notification bell, we have so many more tales from the dusty plains and hidden canyons, stories of the brave, the broken, and the redeemed, waiting to be told. Thank you for listening.